guys, so today I thought I would talk to you about book series that I am not going to finish. So I see a lot of people do videos, and I think I've done one as well, on book series I need to finish. However, there are book series I have started and either read the first couple of books in and have no intention on continuing on with. So I thought I would talk to you about those series here, explain to you why I'm giving up on them, what I thought about the ones that I have read so far, and also engage with you on this topic because, you know, there might be that one series in this video that you convince me to change my mind on and go back to, although I doubt it. So we will see, but without further ado, let's get into the book series that I have no intention of finishing. First things first, I thought I would start with the book series that I think I have read the most books in before giving up on, and I actually enjoyed some of the books in this series. So interestingly enough, this isn't a I hated a book and don't plan on reading its sequels. This is just a series I have stopped caring about, and that is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. So we all know what Game of Thrones is. It is a massively popular television series based on the Song of Ice and Fire series, and I have read the first 3 books in this series, although I read them I think as 4 books because you can buy book 3 as 2 separate books because it's so big, but I think technically I've only read the first 3 books of the series, and there are either 4 or 5 currently out with no end to the series currently. Available. I think fans of the series have been waiting for the final installment for quite some time, but that's not yet on the scene. That's not, however, why I don't plan on finishing this series. It's actually been a few years since I read the last book in the series. I started reading them right when I started BookTube. I had been in a massive reading slump in my final years of high school, my first years of university, and I was getting back into reading. I'd always loved fantasy. I'd loved children's, young adults fantasy, and even a bit of adult fantasy that I'd read when I was younger, and Game of Thrones had started on the television. I think the first season was out, so I was looking for something to like engage me back into reading, and Game of Thrones worked to an extent. However, I have subsequently, since I have been a bigger part of BookTube, since I have explored more adult fantasy, found adult fantasy that I prefer so much more, that really is more the kind of fantasy I'm looking for, and Song of Ice and Fire isn't that. It was like a good in-between that I picked up because of its popularity, but isn't really what I want in fantasy for various reasons. It is low on the magic, and I love magic. There are so many perspectives in these stories, and although I like some multiple perspective narratives, I think I have certainly got a maximum number of characters I care to follow in a book. So a million isn't one of them, and that's what it feels like in A Song of Ice and Fire. And what I find with multiple perspective stories quite often is that I'm only interested in some of the characters, and because there are so many characters in Game of Thrones, there was only like 2-3 max characters whose stories I was genuinely invested in, that I was reading the books for, and so often I'd be taken away from their stories that I would rather read a book that I love all of than just part of now. If there was a series purely following Daenerys Targaryen, if the Game of Thrones books had just been following Daenerys Targaryen, I would have adored them, but as it stands, they were kind of just like a book I read at the time because it was convenient, but I don't care about what happens next. And to be honest, it's the kind of book series where you can just assume it's going to be a miserable ending and everyone you care about dies anyway, so I feel like I know what's going to happen. But like I said, I think I actually gave the first 3 books a mixture of 3 and 4 stars. I didn't hate them, they're just no longer what I want. A book I more actively disliked, however, is the first in the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch. So I had such mixed feelings about this book. I was so sure I was going to love it, and there was so many things about it that I thought were brilliant, but there were equally as many things about it that I detested, to the point where I don't want to read the rest of the books, even for the good elements, because I just don't have time for that nonsense. So what am I talking about? The Rivers of London series follows a police detective in London in contemporary world who gets taken on board by the sort of paranormal, fantastical division of the London Metropolitan Police, who investigate crimes that have some sort of paranormal aspect to them, and he has sort of been taken on board as like a trainee by the head of this department. And that is such a fun, unique concept. These are definitely books with a bit of like a comical side to them, which I enjoy. I like contemporary comical fantasy like Tom Holt. I think generally intriguing premise. However, there was a couple of things that I didn't enjoy as much about the series, and although after book 1 I started book 2, I realised, you know, I was pushing for it for the sake of it. There are book series I prefer much more. They're not worth it for me. And those two things are, the first book's kind of messy, which I'm okay with sometimes. However, I just found like it just spiralled a little bit out of control and got a little bit confused near the end. But my main gripe with these books is that they are very sexist in my opinion. The female characters in the first book were incredibly underdeveloped in comparison to the main character, and the main character constantly reduced the female characters to breasts. Like, it was like, oh, it's been a long time since I've read it, but it was something like he would hug one of them and he'd be like, oh, I feel her breast pushing up against me. Oh, she has breasts. Oh my god, she has... Like, it was so ridiculous. It was just like, anytime he saw a woman, that's all he could think about. And it didn't even really fit with his characterization otherwise, because he was quite a likeable character. This wasn't part of a sort of dislikable characterization of somebody. This was genuinely just what the author thought was like what men think when they see women, and I think more of men than that, so I'm kind of over that series. Another one that I have mixed feelings about, and is probably the one that you could most easily convince me to pick back up, but at the same time I feel like there's so many other book series that I would rather be reading, and I don't think I'm going to like the rest of the books enough to bother. And the reason I've partly actually read so much of the series is because it's just so hyped up, and the way everybody talks about it on BookTube makes me want to love it more than I do, and that is the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. And I don't hate these books, but again, like I said, I just think there are better books for me. The first book is Every Heart a Doorway, and I found this book incredibly underwhelming. It's not a terrible book, but it is this super hyped up book that I just thought was not executed as well as it could be. It's such a fascinating concept, like such a creative concept, so impressed by the author's concept. It's about this boarding school for children who've gone to fairy realms and come back and now feel out of place in our world and want to get back to their fairy world so they can all live together in this boarding school, whilst they hopefully wait to get back to their fairy world. And it is such a unique concept. However, partway through this novella, which is very short, it turns into a murder mystery novel, and it's just like there's too much crammed into a small space. It wasn't enough space for me to explore both that concept fully and properly execute like a murder mystery plot alongside it. Like, it just felt like too much and too much of a jumble, so I never felt entirely attached to it. However, I thought it was interesting enough to read book 2 because that sounded like I would like it more, and book 2 is actually sort of a prequel where you go back to one of the fairy realms and follow 2 of the characters from the first book before they went to this boarding school, and I preferred that book. I really did prefer it, but it was the case of 2-star to 3-star, so it's not like I was madly in love with it. I preferred it. I really enjoyed the female-female romance aspect of it, and again thought it was a unique concept. Enough so that I thought maybe these books are just going to get better and better, so I started book 3 and instantly was not into it at all. It was back to the same setting as the first one, and it just wasn't working for me. I don't know exactly what it is and how to pinpoint it, mainly because I know people love it, so I'm just like, how am I missing what everyone loves about it? But I just couldn't get into that third book. I know there's a 4th book coming out, and for a while I was excited about it, but now I'm just kind of like, oh my gosh, there's so many books out there that I want to read. Why am I reading books that I don't even think I'm going to give more than 3 stars? So I'm probably not going to continue on with that series. Unless anybody else read and didn't like book 1 yet loved book 3. That's the only scenario where I'm going to read it. The next series is actually one I started this year and had again high hopes for, but unfortunately the first book didn't deliver, and that is Queen of Blood, which is the first book in the Queens of Renthia series by Sarah Beth Durst. So I reviewed this one recently because, like I said, I think I read it in January, February, and this book again did not work for me. This was a longer book. This book was more like 400 pages or so, yet it still did not manage to execute itself well in its space of time. It, for me, was such a rushed book. I never felt attached to the characters because I constantly felt like we were jumping in time to like, you know, 5 months later, 6 months later, 1 year later, that it just felt like a lot of telling and not showing, and I never grew to love the characters fully. and it very much looks like, from reading the blurb of the sequel, that it is again like a massive jump forwards in time. It's not even like we're really honing in on more of the everyday life of the character in the first book. So I don't think this is a book series I'm going to prefer if I continue on with, and I didn't love the first one enough to find out more. I didn't hate it, it was just sort of like an average reading experience for me, and once again, why read books that I think are going to get 3 stars when I have books that I think I'm going to give 4 or 5 stars to. The concept itself is a high fantasy novel, again with such an interesting premise. There is these different spirits for all the different elements, so you got water spirits, fire spirits, air spirits, etc. And only women appear to be able to control these spirits, and certain women who have more power than others are sent to the school to train to be the potential heir to the throne, and the most powerful of these women will take over as queen. And we follow one girl in this world as she attends the school and goes through all of this training. But yeah, I wanted to love the central character, I wanted to care about her relationships, but I felt like I never got an opportunity to with this book. I also looked through my Goodreads to see if there was any other series that I had started and didn't intend on finishing, and one that came up was The Witch's Kiss by Catherine and Elizabeth Corr. I was going through such a young adult witchy reading binge when I read this, and I read some great witchy young adult books. Unfortunately, this one wasn't one of them. For me, this book just was not absorbing. It was actually kind of dull, unfortunately. Just nothing much really happens. It is a book that has flashbacks into a sort of more magical past, and those bits I far preferred. And that was actually the reason I think I gave it 2 stars and not 1 star. But the contemporary narrative, where we follow a young girl who is from a family of witches, and this cursed prince and these murders that are going on, was just not interesting. It was like nothing was happening, and I felt that the relationship that developed between them had really no basis, and I couldn't quite get on board with. So I actually almost didn't finish this book, so definitely won't be reading book 2. And another book series I kind of forgotten about that it was even a series is Alice, which is the first in the Chronicles of Alice series by Christina Henry, and I really didn't like this first book. I hate to say it because, I mean, authors put a lot of hard work in behind their books. I know some people love this story, but for me it really I reacted really negatively to reading this book. I felt like the level of sexual violence in it was really gratuitous, and failed to fully explore the ramifications of all of the sexual violence to the extent that I look for in a book that deals with sexual violence, and this book is like every page. So warning, if you are considering reading it, it is like very much steeped in explorations of sexual violence, and I got what the author was trying to do. There was some like interesting metaphors she was trying to make there about patriarchy and sexism and sexual violence, but I did not think it was executed well as a reader. And equally, I found it then strange that the Alice character had what felt like a budding romantic relationship with a character, although who hadn't committed any acts of sexual violence, was still incredibly violent. So it was odd to me that she was then moving over to what could be another kind of abusive, potentially violent relationship after all of the things that she had gone through. It's hard to explain because it's a very like interesting, dark retelling of Alice in Wonderland, where Alice is in a mental hospital, and her experience of travelling to Wonderland in the first place was very different from what we know, and going back there, the Wonderland is actually a very dark, sinister place, more so than even the original story, where basically every character is committing acts of sexual violence. I just did not find it effective as a metaphor. I thought it was heavy-handed, and because of that, ineffective. And I didn't like it, so I'm definitely not reading book 2. I just no. Those, however, are all the book series that I could identify that I really don't intend on continuing on with, whether I started them recently or started them a while ago. I am letting them go. I am not planning to read the books 2, 3 or 4 or wherever I was in the series. However, I am always willing to hear your opinions if you disagree with me, although some of them you really could not convince me to read the next book in. Others maybe. But I'd love to hear if you have read any of these books, if you'd had any similar experiences, or if there are any series that you started thinking you were going to enjoy and then decided that the rest of the books were certainly not for you. Do let me know in the comments down below, but until next time, happy reading and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys.